Right. Good morning, everyone. This is Tuesday, February 6th, and this is the weekly meeting for Sig Docs for Kubernetes. We have a really full schedule today, so let's get cracking. I see Paris is here. Hello, Paris. Before we get rolling, is there anything that you would like to add to our agenda today? Not to put you on the spot. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Let's see. New attendees. Is there anybody who's in this meeting for the first or second time? Chris Nova, hi. Pete Mallory, hello. I'm guessing that Ivan Font is also new. Welcome.
Hi, this is Matt Dorn with CoreOS. Actually, now Red Hat.
Hey, Matt.
Hi.
You've got like, wow, 4.
Record.
Okay, welcome. So this is a pretty typical meeting format. We have an agenda. I will post the link to that agenda. Well, it's already posted in Sig Docs. And if you have anything that you'd like to discuss, please tack it onto the agenda at the end. As mentioned, we have a full agenda today, so we may or may not get to it. All right, let's do follow-ups from last meeting. CNCF is hiring. If you want to work for the Linux Foundation and get paid to care about the quality of Kubernetes documentation as a full-time gig, come talk to me. Message me on Sig Docs and we'll have a chat. All right, let's talk about the style guide. Steve, last week we talked about the idea of adapting an existing style guide. For example, like Google Developer or Google Cloud, if there's a cloud-specific style guide, or continue maturing our existing style guide from scratch. And you, Steve, you said, hey, I'd like to have some time to think about this, and we'll talk about this next week. It's next week. What do you think?
I think we should just stick with our style guide that we're writing from scratch and go with that. A couple of reasons. That keeps it neutral. It doesn't, look like we're starting with something from Google or some other company. And I think style guide that pretty much gives us what we want, and it's just a small amount that we need to add to it. So I'd like to stick with the direction we've taken.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I definitely have opinions, but other thoughts?
So Steve and I talked about this a bit last week, and one of the things I suggested was that as part of an effort to promote the style guide better, because that really is a piece of there's not a lot of point in doing a whole lot more with the content until we, figure out how to evangelize it better. And one of the things that I suggested was that the current content is good, but some reorganization of it might help people find the parts that we're seeing less compliance with more easily. So,
out of curiosity, what are the parts that you see as being less compliant?
Here we go.
Okay, never mind. Why don't we?
Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah,
let's reserve this discussion for offline since we need to move.
Jennifer, it was about to get good.
I know. The tea was about to get spilled. It was about to be just a massacre in here. But let's continue this discussion in a more reflective format, shall we say?
Well, let's let Jennifer finish what she was in the middle of, and then we can.
Fair. Okay.
Well, I really didn't want to fall down a rabbit hole. But the content best practices are things that, even though we see non-compliance in a lot of the formatting stuff, also the content best practices seem to be. People seem sometimes not even to be aware that they exist, let alone, sort of how to follow them. So I suggested moving things around and possibly fiddling with the TOC, just to see whether we can give some more visibility on areas that we think could use more attention.
So that would be things like use active voice, use present tense.
Yeah, use simple and direct language.
Sure. Yeah, that's. I definitely see sort of a consistent pattern of quality issues as well. So those all sound like reasonable suggestions. I agree. Let's not inherit the entirety of a style guide that we don't necessarily need to use. Let's take what we have and address its problem. Well, not exactly problems, but make it as good as it can be. Promote its visibility and effectiveness more, and address the particular pieces that we do see on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is an exercise in the art of the possible.
Okay. The editor's job in a nutshell. Thank you. Okay. Repo team cleanup. So after implementing the automation bots for auto assigning reviewers and for automatically handling approvals, Steve and I last week took on some cleanup tasks, and Steve has done a wonderful job of wrangling access for individual contributors for the repo. So thank you, Steve. I took on the task of adding or of doing some team cleanup for the repo, and I said specifically that I would add reviewer teams to Kubernetes website as specifically for repo teams. As it turns out, not only can we not do that, they would end up being Kubernetes organization teams anyway. So things are working fine as they are. What I have noticed is that there were a couple of folks who used to have write access who don't have write access now, and they're like, hey, I was doing something with that. As far as I know, there are only 2 cases. Joe Heck. Joe, congratulations, you're a new maintainer. And thank you very much for your contributions. So all of that, we adhered to the standards for Kubernetes maintainer outlined in the Kubernetes community repo. And Joe has more than adequately met the standards to be a Kubernetes maintainer. The other person who had write access but doesn't and would like it is Brad Topal. Brad meets the qualifications for a reviewer right now, so I'm going to. He's got, I think, a PR open to become a reviewer. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I saw the PR, and it looks like he was added to the owner's aliases, not the owner's file. Is that the correct place to do that? Because I thought for reviewer, he should be in the owner's file under reviewers.
That's a really good question. Andrew?
Yeah, that's correct. It should be under the owner's file. The owner's alias is for, it's for the tech review stuff, I think.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, thank you.
Probably just need to tweak it a little.
Sure, and give feedback directly on that PR. Okay, cool. So if you used to have write access and you don't now, and you're confused, saddened, and or angered by this, drop me a line and we'll talk. All right, let's move on to our agenda items. Let's talk about approval workflow. So after enabling...
One thing. Actually, when I'm looking at it again, there is an entry in owner's aliases for Sig Docs. So yeah, add them there too.
So
it should be under both files, owners and owner aliases.
Okay, so when we make updates to one file, best practices to update both?
Yeah, because it just gives people the option to just use the Sig Docs alias instead of if they're explicitly assigning using the Sig Docs alias versus the bot auto assigning using the owner's file. That's the difference.
Okay. Very good. Let me make a quick note about that. Let's see. And vice versa. Okay, let's talk about the approval workflow. So when we talked about enabling PROW, we decided initially that LGTM was going to replace tech review, and approve was going to replace doc review and general mergeability. And as it turns out, there's a tooling chain. I don't want to call it a problem because it's not necessarily a problem, just a difference in expectation about how LGTM works. Jennifer, thank you for tracking that conversation in Test Infra. Do you want to talk a little bit about LGTM and LGTM hold and how that's shaking out, and what you think our path forward on that is going to be?
I'm not sure about the path forward. If you take a look at the issue that Zach's linked to in the agenda, there are many opinions. Part of the original impetus, and they do look like, you know, sort of different experiences historically and different opinions. And I've been thinking about it some, that the larger issue is to what extent can we, for the Kubernetes website repository, bring our practices into alignment with the Kate's repo? And to what extent does that complicate things for us, because we do have different needs for reviews from code review. And well, the branching strategy is another aspect of that, right? But for now, so PROW, what happens, this happened because an upstream reviewer who has approver permissions did a tech review on a pull request for 1.10 docs and gave it an LGTM because that's what she's used to doing. And lo and behold, there it went and merged. That was not her intent. And when it was merged, she pinged me in a DM and said, wait a minute, how and why did this happen? Please, can we still get a doc review? And I said, sure, that's not a problem. And then I took the conversation up with Aaron, and then the issue happened. So the issue is not just whether we adjust our review commands, but how we promote the commands you use to other teams.
Thank you. That is
hold. If we use that for tech review, we're going to have to make sure that tech reviewers or anybody who comes in doing a tech review, you know, in this case, it was the SIG lead. She's not particularly identified as a tech reviewer for us anywhere. So we have both the decision about which commands to use and then how to effectively communicate that. I think that no matter what, we're going to have to be a bit hypervigilant on things for a while.
So I have a very strong feeling on this. And I don't know if this is possible, but my strong feeling is that LGTM should not have different meanings depending on who you are. LGTM for us should mean one thing only, tech review. And you don't get automatic merging unless someone has given an LGTM and someone has given an approve. This idea that LGTM, if you are an approver, means both LGTM plus approve, I think is where the problem is.
Joe,
I personally agree. Again, I think we might be up against the art of the possible because it's clear that some of the folks who own PROW don't want to make the commands mean different things in different repos.
Okay, well, that's a good piece of
I'm going to
info.
bust in. I want to make sure that Joe gets a chance to put in his thoughts. Joe?
No, it's great conversation. I don't mean to cut it off. I think regardless of where we go with the future of this, and if they make it configurable, which I would love, but yeah, I'm looking at the same comments, and it's unclear if they want to make that sort of variability an option, that we should implicitly start to use hold as a common option and just, say, hey, up front, hey, this doesn't mean anything bad about your PR. We just want to make sure it doesn't merge until we've had somebody else come in, and just means, especially as approvers, we need to pay attention to the holds not just assume that it means don't merge it whatsoever and then remove them when appropriate.
So, okay, thank you. Steve, I'm sorry Steve and Jennifer, I'm sorry to cut you off. Is there anything more that you wanted to say about that before we, is there anything more that you want to say about that?
Well, I think some strategy like always putting a hold on until we unhold is fine for now. But I'm really against this idea of LGTM meaning different things. It's complicated. It has to be explained to people. And how hard is it to write /LGTM/approve if that's what you really mean? I don't understand why we need this hidden behavior behind /LGTM. So I guess I should jump in on wherever this debate is happening.
Sure. There's a link in the agenda. Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. And also specifically, I like, saying defaults. And so I don't think it's good to have to explicitly say hold every single time, because then if you forget, then it's going to get merged. And that's not the behavior that we want. I would rather it be clean and be like, yeah, LGTM, and then also add /approve, if you want to do both. It's like,
Yep. It's also clear, just to summarize some of the discussion in the issue for those who haven't looked at it, it's clear that different people have different expectations of the bot's behavior. Even though they say it ought to mean this, that, or the other thing, whether it's present behavior or some other behavior, they've got different expectations. The dev who LGTM'd the PR that raised the issue for me clearly did not expect a merge. Right. And, she's working in, Kate's and isn't used to that happening there either. And I also agree that it's just it's a matrix to have a command mean something different depending on what your role is in an owner's file. That's bonkers.
Right.
Yeah.
It is.
And that seems like an upstream issue. That's not just us, but let's just get our little corner of the garden cleaned up.
Oh, yeah. Plus,
and I would rather have someone be surprised that the command did less than they expected than having them be surprised that the command did more than they expected.
I think that's totally reasonable. The expectation that a command should be sort of immediately transparent and well-bounded and not require a systemic understanding of chain of ownership through different cascading organizational teams, I think is a reasonable one. So I would encourage everyone to please chime in on the discussion in the link listed on Test Infra, because this is, I think that's a valid concern, not just for our team, but for all teams who use Prow in the Kubernetes org. Yeah, that's a usability concern that I think impacts, that has a far wider ranging impact than just our own approval process. Okay.
Sig testing has an update today.
Sorry, Paris, go ahead.
I was going to say Sig testing has an update meeting today at 1 o'clock PST if folks want to jump on that for a live conversation.
Thank you. I'll make a note about that. Let's see. Sig test update meeting at 1 p.m. PST today. Okay, cool. Let's talk quickly about user journeys, specifically that they're awesome and wonderful and they're a thing that's real. And yes, well done all. And let's talk a little bit about what's next. I have seen issues opened, talking a couple of from Steve, talking specifically, Steve and Jennifer talking about specific changes to make next. Do you want to cover briefly less the specifics and more about the development cycle for what you see happening with user journeys next?
Um, are you thinking about the issue that I can remember I opened was about navigation, and it was just things that it works okay now. I think it could be better in certain ways, like the way it does automatic scrolling, the way the back arrow doesn't always work on first click, and that. So I listed all those things. Other than that, I don't remember other changes that I suggested. My one general suggestion is that next we need to go to the topics that are linked to from the user journeys and make sure those topics are really, we make them as good as they can be, make sure they're up to date, follow the style guide, and really do what we intend them to do.
Absolutely. Jennifer, anything you want to chime in about user journeys, specifically as a what's next?
I don't think so. I think that Steve has really outlined where the issues are and where we go next. And I'm not prepared to think beyond that at this point.
Okay. Yeah, no,
I have some thoughts.
Andrew, go for it.
So now that it's out, I want to have a concerted effort to basically test it, like have people use it, get some feedback, see where it's working well, where it's not, and where we can improve things. And then also, I think we can also add some things to like what's next. So if they are part of this user journey thing, that we can kind of make that path more smooth between the different topics. And I also want to try to understand the analytics better so we can monitor, the user behavior and see if it is more effective or not.
That's all really good. I'm just taking notes.
Andrew, I don't necessarily see the analytics. Is there any way that we could get maybe a readout after it's been up for a month just to see how the patterns have shifted, in terms of the analytics and so forth?
Yeah, I have access to the analytics. I've been looking at them. The thing I suspect is that most of the behavior comes in through search. Like I think it's something like over 90%. So and a lot of the people go straight to like kube control reference docs, So I don't know how we want to parse that in terms of like, do we want to kind of put them into different buckets and ignore the ones that are just searching for reference material, and then just focus on looking at the ones that are coming to the site looking for like the overall understanding, So it's something we kind of have to think about and decide.
Yep, makes sense.
I don't want to take this too far down the rabbit hole of details, but I will post a link in the agenda to some really good articles along these lines by Bob Watson, who has done a ton with both the opportunities and the limitations of analytics for documentation, where the interaction is not primarily transactional. But he's good about the limitations, but then he's also really good about what else you can do to measure the effectiveness and the quality of content. So I will find the right links. I got his site up now, but I will find the specific links and paste them in the agenda.
Yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yes.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, it's analytics are I think one of our broader concerns for the year is how do we actually measure what we do and the impact that we have. So yeah, I think this is the hot stuff when it comes to what we need to be thinking about, like as a SIG, is a way to measure the impact of what we do. Andrew, thank you for thinking about the site analytics, specifically in the context of what to do with reference hits from search. Yeah, I think that's worth sort of a longer ongoing discussion. I don't know if we need to silo it or if we can just have that in Sig Docs, but that's definitely a conversation I'd like to continue. Okay, let's see. So I have next on the agenda expectations and how to volunteer for review duties. This is really important, but I also want to make sure that we get time to talk about how to host cluster registry docs. Joe, are you okay if we switch the order of cluster registry and volunteer expectations?
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome, thank you. I think we can still get to it today. I just want to make sure that we really get to talk about hosting cluster registry docs.
Yeah,
okay.
sounds good.
So, Ivan, you, first of all, thank you for coming to us and asking where to host docs. We'd love to host them, and the Kubernetes website is the right repo to host them. Let's see.
Yeah, thank you for accommodating us on the schedule. I appreciate that.
So just to recap how we got here, as Ivan, you joined Sig Docs and asked what's the best practice for where to host docs and how to make sure that docs that are generated from cluster registry are properly hosted in Kubernetes website. And like about the tooling chain and about how to make that happen. Is that it? Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. We've actually, so cluster registries, a fairly newish project. It's under the multi-cluster SIG charter. And we basically it's a building block for a lot of other multi-cluster initiatives, and we're at the point where we're trying to evolve the API to beta, and as in the process of doing that, we're looking for a more formal location for housing the documentation. Currently, we're using just Markdown inside of the GitHub repo, and while that works, we don't have a lot of users accessing the cluster registry at this time. As we evolve the API to beta, we will expect to see more people interested in using it. And we're certainly okay with using the existing solution as by just having Markdown inside of the GitHub repo, or perhaps GitHub pages, or hosting our own GitHub pages in the cluster registry repo. But certainly we'd like to get some guidance from this SIG regarding, what is the best practice for an official repository, an official Kubernetes repo? Is there precedent with some other project that we can use as a reference point? Those types of questions. And I see that, for example, Federation does exist in the existing Kubernetes docs, and while the Federation repo has been moved out, I suspect that it'll continue to host the documentation inside of Kubernetes .io. So yeah, just wanted to kind of get feedback from the SIG, regarding what you see as the best solution moving forward. And granted, we are in the process of potentially splitting out the repo into maybe a cluster registry API specific repo and maybe a client repo, because we do have a lot of dependencies on various different third-party libraries and things that make it a little bit cumbersome to vendor in the cluster registry. But I don't think that should change the discussion of where we host the docs, because wherever they do move, we'll end up having to implement a similar strategy in any of the necessary repos to be able to store the docs in some consumable website.
Sure, that was going to be one of my questions for you. As I took a look at the cluster registry repo and saw like the API, you have API documentation, you have some client documentation, and so that was going to be, I guess, one of my questions about what your particular like what kind of content you specifically are that we need to talk about in terms of hosting requirements. I see. So Chris Nova has some questions. I see that she just dropped out, but let's see. Let's defer on those momentarily. See if she rejoins us. Joe, do you had your hand up?
I was just going to highlight that Chris was asking some questions, and I don't know how it overlays to this concept of incubation and so forth.
Okay. So I don't know. Ivan, would you like to, let's see what her questions are? So is the cluster registry a core primitive?
So the cluster registry today is not a core primitive for other aspects of Kubernetes, but it is a pretty fundamental and foundation building block for multi-cluster solutions. So the Federation code itself is also kind of an official project, and it's looking to leverage the cluster registry long term to use that as a way of storing and retrieving clusters. There is currently discussions on potentially sort of refactoring parts of the cluster registry into some core primitives, something like an environment registry. I know that API Machinery is very interested in coalescing some of the aspects of the cluster registry, such as like the Kubernetes API endpoints, to be able to maybe put that in API Machinery sometime long term, and then the cluster registry would then use that core primitive and build on top of it some of the cluster registry aspects of it.
Okay. Out of curiosity, well, no. So are you being invited to participate in like Kubernetes releases? So like, are you part of the 1.10 release cycle? Are you like scheduled for the 1.11 release cycle? Have you gotten any like contact or invitation about participating in the release schedule?
No, we actually have our own separate release. Since we're outside of the Kubernetes repo already, we're not gated by the Kubernetes releases themselves. I don't foresee that changing, but right now we're kind of under our own release charter. We've recently released a few versions of alpha right now, and it's on our own cadence.
Gotcha. Thank you. So Steve, I see that you linked to the Federation API generated reference. Do you want to say more about the context of that link?
Yeah, just that might serve as a model for one way of doing, of getting these new reference docs into Kubernetes.io. I see that there might be three possibilities. The simplest one is Andrew could talk about. That's automatically pulling in markdown files from another repository into our repository and just having the markdown files viewable. And then the next easiest thing would probably be to do something similar to what the Federation docs do. They have scripts and Golang code that takes markdown files and generates a big HTML file, and then that's what we publish. And then the most complicated would be what we do with our Kubernetes API docs. That's in the same section of the table of contents that I linked to just now. That's where we use the code that Phil Whitrock wrote, and it's at Kubernetes incubator/reference docs. So those are what I see as the three possibilities in order of simple to most work.
Sure. So Chris did ask a good question though, is should we host docs for projects that have or haven't graduated yet to inclusion in the Kubernetes release cycle? I can't recall the history of Federation immediately to mind in terms of like when in the life cycle of Federation, like Federation docs specifically, like when we started hosting those. Or KubeADM. I wish Fabrizio was here. I don't know. Does anyone remember when in the Federation lifecycle we specifically began hosting Federation docs?
At least in Fabrizio's use case, it was when they kind of went beta. They wanted to explicitly move it in and merge it with the rest of it, and so that was kind of their big marker point in terms of shifting it in, and then they were adopting that same kind of release cadence as the rest of the Kubernetes project at that time.
Okay, so that's a really good question, Ivan. I don't know if we have a really good answer for you for when we would start to begin hosting. But that I think that's a discussion that we need. That's a longer discussion. I think the how to do it is probably easier to answer, as we've done it before. But the when in the life cycle of cluster registry is a more nebulous question, and that's the thing I think we're going to have to chew on. So I'm thinking about like what specifically we can do next and how to answer that question, and who we need to talk to about that.
So Ivan, you're coming up on beta soon. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's right. We're looking at finalizing some specific details in order to achieve kind of a beta release of the API.
And how soon do you think that would be?
Hopefully by the end of March, I would think, sometime within the next 1 or 2 months.
Yeah. Well, I don't see that we would have any trouble with hosting beta docs. We do quite a bit of that. And if this is happening by the end of March, I think we can probably just go forward with it. Well, I don't know, Zach, what do you think?
I think on that kind of timeline, it would make sense to begin hosting beta docs. So let's figure out sort of the most workable path to get cluster registry docs hosted in Kubernetes website. I think of the three options that you outlined, Steve, just the first, the least, the lowest effort one of just migrating Markdown documentation, migrating Markdown files to Kubernetes website is probably the way to go. I suspect that will create some file divergence as we are editing and working on documentation files in website. So we'd have to figure out a way, Ivan, to make sure that changes made in website were getting ported back to the originals in the cluster registry repo. So just to avoid merge conflicts for one, but also to make sure that documentation stays current. Jennifer, you've got your hand up. Why?
No, there's drawbacks to every choice, right? So I'm just pondering those, but I don't want to be a decision maker here. I haven't had to be very hands-on with any of this stuff yet, although I'm about to be. So
I'd like to hear Andrew's thoughts on this, but it seems to me we would want to set it up so we don't have merge. We don't maintain things in two places. And I think that's what we're doing now with community docs that are pulled in and hosted under Kubernetes website, is that the definitive source is in some other repo, and all we do is have a mechanism for pulling those in and displaying them. It's the same with, say, the Kubernetes or the kubectl reference docs. The definitive source, say, would be the Kubernetes source code itself and the comments that are in the source code files. And so we don't ever make direct changes to those docs that then get into conflict with the definitive source.
That's fair.
You want to let Joe talk, and then I can throw in my 2 cents?
Yeah, go for it, Joe.
The one note about that process is that means that those docs are typically updated on our release schedule, so the Kubernetes releases. So if there's a need to update them more frequently, that's not something that's well accommodated by that external source copying in concept.
Right. Okay. So I think then we need sort of the second phase, because we have that script that can import docs, but then we might want to create some automation around it so that it's more frequent than the releases. And then we should come up with some guidelines, specifically what they need to, what format they should have for the Markdown files for us to import it. Specifically, they need to include the title and the front matter, and we should probably also have them put in comments or somewhere so that it says where the source is, right? This is the repo where the the canonical version is that you should change. And then we should also, in the front matter, mark it so that there's like a no edit like flag. So if you have that on, then it won't have that edit button on our repo or on our site, so that they can't edit it, in our repo.
So I agree with you that having, especially for a project that's approaching beta, like the frequency of updates is going to be faster than our own update schedule. So Ivan, I think what that's turning into in terms of concrete action for the cluster registry team for docs is are you willing to adopt the Kubernetes style guide in terms of like how your markdown files are formatted? There are a couple of things, like Andrew mentioned, that we would need to add, like a no edit flag on the generated or on the results that we publish on the site, and some mention in the content somewhere that points to a canonical source for editing and updates. Are those all agreeable?
Yes, I think so. We haven't really implemented a documentation strategy yet, and so can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. Zoom was just freezing up on me for some reason. So since we don't have a strategy yet, this is kind of the discussions that I was hoping to foster and be able to move towards as we achieve beta, and looking at what the documentation strategy should look like. So I've taken a look at some of the things you guys have, some of the tools you guys use, and some of the tools that some of the other repos use. So I think we can definitely leverage a lot of that stuff. I know Joe's pointed a lot of that stuff out to me as well through the Slack channel. So I've taken a peek at that stuff. So incorporating that stuff shouldn't be any issue.
Okay, awesome. And we can take a look at, I guess, at the script tooling on our side to check for updates and pull updated files from the source into Kubernetes website more regularly.
What infrastructure runs that?
Andrew, do you want to talk about our?
Sorry, I missed that question.
It's all good. Talking about the script infrastructure and what particular infrastructure does the actual script checking. So, like when an upstream source makes an update, what's the machinery that pulls that in?
Oh, well, it's not that advanced yet. So right now, it just basically it's a Go script that you run manually, and it will like copy the repo, and you just specify from where and then to where. But yeah, we can, if someone has some spare cycles, like well, actually, we should not have to do like a diff to compare the two. We should just always pull in what the source is. And that way we can just have some simple automation that will do it. The other option I was thinking is we could add it to the build commands for like the production site, so that when it does a build, it will pull in like a fresh copy of the docs. But that would probably slow things down a lot, because we're going to be doing this for a bunch of repos.
So I guess the short answer, Ivan, is it's a work in progress. All right.
Let me just add one more thing about the complexity of this, and that is if you want to get from the Kubernetes source code, say, into our documentation, you need to be, say, if you want to update something in our 1.9 documentation, you need to be pulling from the source code that's in the Kubernetes 1.9 branch. Well, it's kind of tricky to get things into a Kubernetes release branch. The way you have to do it is check in or merge a pull request into their master branch and then request a cherry pick of an individual commit, not counting the part that generated the docs, into the 1.9 branch. And then once you're in the 1.9 branch, regenerate the docs so that they are appropriate only for 1.9, not the ongoing work in master. So that's just one example of the complexities we're up against with trying to automate this.
Yeah. All right. Is anything more to say about cluster registry? Ivan, any more questions or concerns?
No, I guess just as a summary, just to figure out what kind of action items there are. It sounds like we need to figure out the beta strategy. Once the API becomes beta, we should have a better idea of how the repos may or may not be split, whether API machinery adopts any foundational cluster registry things. In the meantime, it sounds like I can probably communicate with the SIG regarding how to start incorporating those tools, to start generating the markdown that's needed, and perhaps that's a discussion we can have at that point.
Yes, and also to adopt the some of the specific the individual file formatting for Kubernetes documentation, like the title block, some callout formatting, some of the things that are specific to how we publish Markdown files in Kubernetes website. They're basically just adopting the style guide for content that's published.
Okay, and then is that just?
As well.
I'm sorry.
So that's a conversation that can be ongoing as well.
Okay, yeah, that's something that I'll be interested in. So it sounds like I can be in contact with somebody from the SIG regarding incorporating that into your infrastructure tool to pull in whatever we need published, and assuming that we are adopting the style guide that you guys request.
So Ivan, one last question. Is it only reference docs that we're talking about here, or is it also other kinds of docs like tasks and concept pieces?
There might be a little bit of tasks and concept things. We don't have a lot of material for that right now, but I could foresee something like that in the future. But it's mostly just API reference, open API stuff, command usages right now, and that can be generated using Cobra's framework and all that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Ivan, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's awesome to have you. And you're welcome to stick around for the last 10 minutes or so, or you can drop off. We're going to move on and talk about how to be a good reviewer.
Great. Thanks everybody for accommodating this.
Cheers. Take care.
Thanks.
All right. We've got about 10 minutes left to talk about how to be a good reviewer and Joe's PR to that effect. I don't think that we're going to be able to do justice to this in 10 minutes, but I think we can at least get started. So, Joe, do you want to talk about, do you want to give an overview of the PR and talk about where we are? And just give us some of the context that we were missing last week?
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of spurred out of multiple side conversations that kind of came in on the edges of the SIG Slack channel, where I had people asking me, how do I become a reviewer? How do I get involved in this? You know, just that whole cascade of things. And then some side conversations I had with Jennifer about, well, you know, we're not being necessarily very good about always managing to apply the style guide. You know, this guy right here being one of those people that's really bad at it. So trying to get better at it explicitly and move that whole thing forward. As a part of that process for myself, I decided, well, I'll take a look at throwing the straw man in place and actually putting it down and saying, here's what we should do, here's what we shouldn't do, and then digging apart the pieces that had to do with how this approval mechanism worked, things along those lines, and how it went in. There's some stuff that I didn't put in that PR that I thought was relevant for us to have as a discussion point, but wasn't relevant for formal documentation. And I put that in the pull request, what do you call that, description? Yes. For the existing maintainers, just as a, here's what I'm thinking as a baseline for this as documentation.
Cool. So I think this is awesome. I think it's a great way to clarify a piece of our process that's been really nebulous. I think you prompted some really good questions specifically about I guess best practices for reviewers. Like right now, we have been assigning PRs, but then reviewing and merging each other's PRs, even though they're assigned. We don't have a clear SLA established about like how quickly do we respond to PRs. I've been wonderful about that and terrible about that, like sometimes in the same week. I think this is a great opportunity to clarify some of the pieces of review that that need to be clarified, that aren't clear and aren't working. So Joe, your PR is a great start, and if I have seen I've seen folks leave comments in there, but I want to encourage everyone to read and make comments on what is that 7133, the role expectations. So the two things that I'd like to have a little more clarity on is, well, the first thing that I'd like to see clarity on is an SLA. So what is a reasonable expectation for us to respond to an assigned PR for review? There may not be like a hard and fast rule that always works for us, given that we travel to conferences and holiday schedules and things like that. But I mean, what is a reasonable general expectation for us to respond to a PR assignment? Like is 48 hours too fast? It seems fast to me. Is 4 days, is 72 hours enough time? Joe, do you have?
Originally, I was thinking, hey, if you haven't had, once it gets assigned to somebody, if you haven't had a chance to look at it within a week or two, that's the sort of time frame I was thinking about. Then maybe we need to allow somebody else to come in or explicitly reassign it to somebody else so that it doesn't get lost in the weeds and never gets attention. I've even had a couple PRs that have been up there, and I don't know, just because of who they got randomly assigned to, I didn't get the feedback in a couple weeks kind of time frame.
Sure. I don't know. What are folks' thoughts? I mean, even if you don't complete the review, I think like a service level agreement for when to complete, when to merge a PR. That's not a discussion I think we're ready to have yet, but at least for like just even like a comment on it, say, hey, I'm reviewing this PR, just some kind of response to a review assignment. What's a reasonable expectation?
I'm kind of thinking 1 week. That if somebody submits a PR, they ought to hear something from us. See that it's received some attention in a week. And I don't always get to that, because the trick is trying to do my own writing and blend that with looking at other people's writing can be tricky sometimes. But I know if I submitted a PR and it got no attention for a week, I'm starting to feel neglected.
That's fair. Other thoughts? Is 1 week? Folks like 1 week? Is that too fast? Is that too slow?
Let's call it a service level objective to cut ourselves some slack. Not a service level agreement. That's
fair. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I certainly don't have the legal authority to sign an SLA. They barely let me write with anything other than crayons and handle sharp scissors, let alone sign complicated legal agreements.
Yeah. Jennifer, Andrew, what do you guys think?
I think 1 week is reasonable. I mean, my more optimistic self, like a year ago, would have wanted it shorter, but I think the more realistic self says a week is fine.
Okay, so how about we try this? How about we say when you are assigned a PR, when it's not FetaBot and it's not Prow. What's the bot that does automatic assignment? It's the other one of the three.
Blunderbuss.
Thank you. When Blunderbuss assigns a PR, or someone manually assigns a PR, that even if it's just even just an emoji, something to say, hey, I'm looking at this PR, that will review that, will respond to a PR within 1 week. And if someone hasn't responded to it.
Are we using Blunderbuss right now? I'm sorry, Zach. Are we using Blunderbuss right now? Because it seems to me like there's a whole long list of unassigned PRs in there.
Are they? Is there?
Yeah.
Maybe it got turned off. Yeah, you're right.
Ooh.
I mean, I was going in, I have not reviewed this week yet, but I was going in last week and just reviewing the unassigned ones and trying to get some motion. I'm pretty sure Joe was doing the same.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it is running, or I don't think it's running like we expect it to run.
So I just figured, okay, I'll go in there and do what I can, but I feel I'm happy to commit to doing my part to meet 1 week service level objective. I feel like it's harder for me to define my part if we haven't got the bot going.
That's fair. Okay, we're running short on time, so
I'll keep doing what I was doing last week, but that's not, my confidence level drops.
It's all good. So let's generally say 1 week to respond, and let's follow up on Blunderbuss. And let's pick this up next week. Sound good?
Also, like for next week, I want to make a suggestion that maybe we have a rotation where there's like each week one person is kind of responsible for making sure that like we've kind of responded to things within a week. They're kind of like the shepherd, maybe.
That sounds good. Okay, so we'll talk about like a Wrangler proposal next week as well. Okay, 3, 2, 1, good. Thanks everyone for a good SIG meeting. Yep, see y'all next week.
Thank you.